So I became aware of the Africa galleries and its state of being in the late 1990s. And I had really never thought about it critically when I had visited before the late 1990s. I had took my children to the museum in the late 80s and the early 90s, but I only took them and went like everybody else, just went to see the museum. But by the time I went there in the late 1990s, I had become aware of the utter importance of how visual culture impacted how people thought about what it means to be black, how people considered black bodies, whether those black bodies be in Africa, whether they be in Asia, whether they be in the Americas. And over the years, I had become increasingly interested in this from my more empirical work in sociology, that the narrative that we told about the history of Africa and the African diaspora, that those two histories worked organically together. So the negative stereotypes which held for Africa have long guided how people exhibit African bodies, African objects, African material culture. I became interested in let's change that. I became interested in how do we change that narrative, because to remove the colonial mentality which collected these items from the items required in the first stage a reconsideration of the history of these objects, the narrative of these objects. Most of the objects collected by the Penn Museum for its Africa collection were brought in during the period of colonialism. And the way people thought about Africa and its material culture was in a colonial way. And if they didn't think about it in the colonial way, then they thought about it in the enslavement way. So neither way reflected on the humanity of Africa or the humanity of Africans or the humanity of those individuals who exist in the African diaspora. And so I became increasingly interested in discussing this problematic with the director of the museum. And so during the end of the 90s and in the beginning of the 21st century, I began to have a series of conversations with the directors of the Penn Museum about changing this narrative, because what existed in the museum had been there for over 30, 40 years. And not only was it bad in terms of the way the objects were displayed, but it was also bad in terms of how they talked about Africa and African material culture. So I had a desire to change that very early on. It's only about 5 years ago that it became possible for me to consider how I might make that happen. What could I do to transform this process? 5 years ago, I began to curate galleries and I began to put together exhibitions. And so I was determined to bring the insights I had gained from those activities to the Penn Africa collection. But it was a much bigger task than I had ever pursued before in terms of galleries and in terms of museums. It was a much more encompassing process. It took me about a year just to get the idea right. And I got the idea right by traveling all over the world, visiting African galleries, African exhibitions, the kind of state of art and how people were talking about African material culture. And then from that, I began to articulate a vision for these new museums. And this vision for me began with being decolonial. It needed to decolonize the view of what it means to be a human, to decolonize the view of what it means to be an African, to decolonize the view of the relationship between Africa and its African diaspora. So I was determined to put together a gallery which just attacked all of these stereotypes in one breath. I wanted to refresh what we thought about Africa. I wanted to refresh what we thought about the connection between Africa and the African diaspora. And I wanted to refresh the need to have a decolonial narrative about Africa. So once we came up with the concept, I began the process of working with the staff in the museum to select from the 70,000 objects that exist. Because for me to conceptualize of the Africa collection includes Nubia, includes Egypt, and includes northern, southern, eastern, western Africa. It includes Africa as a continent which goes back in time and forward in time in a way that it ends up with the African diaspora here, the African diaspora there. So my whole conceptualization of Africa and the African diaspora is a much more global conceptualization. I recognize as an African American the importance of my own standpoint, my own position in this conversation, yet I believe that it is necessary to go beyond one standpoint in order to find intellectual communion, intellectual collaboration with others who might be situated in a similar way. And if you do that with the correct empathy, then you will end up with all of humanity. And therefore you will end up thinking about how do we reorganize these galleries so that it teaches all of us how to be a better human. What way does the conversation about Africa and about the African diaspora and Africa's material culture using these objects which were collected for a different purpose, in what way can we use this constellation of factors to create a different conversation about what does it mean to be a human being? And this, I think, is one of the advantages of Africana studies. It is a holistic perspective which allows us to not only talk about our experience, but talk about the utter necessity for us to empathize with those in power and those without power, and to try to portray a way of looking at the world to those who are not us, to see us as part of their situation, whether they are in a subordinate or superordinate position, whether they are in power or whether they lack power. There is a need for human beings to have a common empathy if we will have the ability of understanding, have the ability of having a mutual conversation. And museums are a perfect place for situating this conversation. Because in a museum, tens of thousands of children visit every year. Tens of thousands of teachers visit every year. Tens of thousands of everyday people visit every year. And so it is really an opportunity to engage in this question about being a human, to engage in this question about redefining what we think is a human being in a much more palatable way for all of humanity. And so my idea in putting these galleries together was that anytime anyone looks at any part of these galleries, they should be able to ask these three questions. They should be able to ask, why is this object here? What does this object mean? And why is it here at this moment, in this space? You know, why this object at this moment in this space? And using that as my guideline, it allowed me to forefront provenance. Where did this object come from? And it allowed me to talk about the methods of transferring material culture, because some of these objects were stolen from Africa. And so they find their circulation as a consequence of that theft. So we need to know that provenance when we look at the object. We should know that we're looking at something that is stolen and misplaced from its context. Some of these items are spiritual items, and they have a significance, a spiritual significance, a sacred significance in Africa. So they don't have that same significance sitting behind the glass with the label that we put on it. So we need to appreciate that so that we can contextualize the significance of having these objects in front of us at that particular moment. And what does it mean for us to look at it? And what can we gain from that in terms of our existence as a human being? And so that's what we try to do in these galleries. And to do that, you need to decolonize the museum. Because when people collected these objects, they collected them thinking about Africa as a colony, thinking about Africans as inferior, thinking about Africans through a racist lens, thinking about individuals in the African diaspora as through a racist lens. And when you think about somebody through a racist lens, what it results in is you thinking of them as inferior, of you thinking of them as less than something. And so while we show the horrors of enslavement and the horrors of colonialism, that in no way prevents us from highlighting Africa's contribution to civilization. And so for me to get the story right, I didn't just tell it myself. I got an advisory board of individuals who are very versed in African material culture from around the world. I got a set of artists to respond from Africa and the African diaspora to what we were doing. So you will find 3 very significant installations. And these installations are in conversation with what we did in the galleries. The conversation I had with the 5 scholars enhanced the galleries. And so in many ways, what I was trying to do is generate a conversation by having a conversation. Some of that conversation was intellectual, some of that conversation was visual, but basically it was conversation. And that's what we have today. So if you arrive at the galleries today, you cannot read any of the labels, and you should get our message about decolonizing the museum. If you go through and you only read the labels, you will get our message about decolonizing the museum. If you go through and you pay only attention to the contemporary installations, you will get the same. So we try to give a unified message. And the way we did that was by reconceptualizing the design. And we reconceptualized the design from how we put the cases in, to the lighting of the cases, to the color of the walls, to the addition of air conditioning, and to the installation of videos and video interactives and hands-on interactives so that people can have a tactile experience as well. In 1891, using the new technology of photography, an individual was in the palace in Benin, and he took a photo of the altar in the palace in Benin. The Oba at that time would have fashioned one of these sculptures on the altar after his father, and a big piece of ivory would have come out of its head as a symbol of his power and connection to the eternal on earth. And this sculpture would have been made of bronze. And these sculptures have been taken from this palace in 1897 and scattered around Europe and the United States. Now, on that altar, you see things that were also stolen from the palace. And we have a whole collection of them in the Penn Museum. They have a collection of them in the Boston Museum. They have a collection of them in the Met. They have a collection of them in the British Museum. They have a collection of them in the Louvre. They have a collection of them in the Humboldt Forum. They have a collection of them all over the world. But very rarely do you find any collection of objects of material culture like this on the African continent. And you cannot find this collection in Benin. I've been there. I looked in the Benin Museum. I looked in the Benin Palace. You don't find that, right? And so, what does it mean to display this sculpture here in Philadelphia, in the Penn Museum? Does it have the same significance? Does it have the same meaning? What does it allow us to do? And I say the best thing it allows us to do is to tell a different narrative about what happened in Benin society. The best it allows us to do is to say we will change our ways and develop a relationship with the museums in Benin City to share this cultural material. That we will find a way to better circulate material culture from Africa around the world as an educational object that belongs to humanity, but that it should be under the stewardship of the Benin people. That's what this can allow us to do. Because on that altar, in that photo from 1891, you can see wax. So candles were burned. It almost as if you can see a mist coming from it, that you can think of that there's a smell there, but you don't have it. You can look at it and you can say there's something visually going on. Maybe somebody's playing a drum. You don't hear it. Maybe someone is engaged in a chant. You don't hear it. Maybe someone's ringing the bell. You don't hear it. Right? So you cannot replicate the smells, the sounds, the visuality of what is occurring on that altar in any other space. It takes on a different meaning here. Now its meaning is about the material culture of a time once gone, about a people who have been separated from this material culture, about a time in which taking things out of Africa and situating them in the Americas was taken for granted. And that's what happened to create the African diaspora. And that is what happened to create this diaspora of objects from Benin, from the great Benin kingdom, from the culture of the Edo people there. And so when people ignore that fact and think that they can simply discuss these objects in abstraction, they really do us a great disservice. And I think that's what has been happening in museums where they presented these objects. They've done us a great disservice by not contextualizing the object, by not giving us the provenance of the object, by not explaining to us why they put it in front of us. So our solution was, for example, we post one letter where someone is trying to sell Penn some of these objects directly from the looted, right, in the museum. They're trying to sell Penn Museum that objects that were looted from the Benin Palace. And they're talking about it as it's being taken. And so that's a provenance story, which is what you're looking at. This is how it's got here. That's a provenance story. Now, not everything in the collection was stolen. For example, in the 1930s, one of the curators for the museum went to Sorobo Island off of Sierra Leone, and he purchased a mask, a sewing mask, which is a secret women's society. And he purchased the mask. Now, these masks have a sacred name. We don't know the name. Okay? So how, if we have the mask without its name, we can't know the mask? Because the mask is imbued with its name, and that gives it its significance. I don't care what you believe, you have to respect that the people who created this, they gave it a name in secret, and that name in secret empowered it in their mind in terms of what it did for them. Can we respect that for them? having the object in this space, we have a clear provenance. We know the woman he bought it from. We know how much he paid for it. Yet, there is still a certain estrangement from this material culture and its placement in the Penn Museum.
I think I have enough.
Okay.
Is there anything else you wanted to say, or?
No, you got it. This is how I'm rolling with it. I sent you one of the things so that you'd see. I've been giving a lot of interviews about this collection. It's just, it has been something that I really wanted to do. And I like doing work that I'm passionate about. I like doing work that I think will help people, right? I'm not just a person who wants to write a book and write it to other scholars. That's important too, and I do that. But I also like to engage in projects where I can touch the young, where I can touch the old, where I can touch the normal and the average. And I want to commune and conversate with them, because I think it's there that I can be my best, and it is there that I can do my best service. Many of the objects in the gallery are currently listed as fetish in the catalog, as being a fetish. Well, the idea of a fetish is when you take an object, a piece of material culture, and you separate it from the people, and you separate it from the history of the people who fashioned this material culture. And so material culture doesn't just exist as an object, it exists as an object in relationship to people. And it is often a mistake made to disassociate the material culture from the creators of the material culture from the carriers of the material culture. And so the thing we do intentionally is to reconnect African material culture both to the place and space in which it was created and by whom it was created, but also we connect it to that other aspect of the material cultural diaspora, if you will, of Africa. So while these objects came from Africa, millions of people also came from Africa. And these millions of people carried this culture in them. And this was just a manifestation, a physical manifestation of that culture. So for us, it is essential to have this material culture in conversation with the diaspora. Because while these objects may be a diaspora, so are these individuals. So when you enter the galleries, you will see a facade. And that facade will have this black metal. And in it is carved the orishas. And these orishas are deities, are gods from the Yoruba religion, from the Fan religion, from so many African-based religions as they were converted to religious practices in the Americas. This is the basis of Candomblé. It is the basis of Santeria in Cuba. It is the basis of Voodoo in Haiti. So these religious practices in the Americas are simply a cultural manifestation of this physical objects that we have in these museums. And so we wanted to eliminate the space in between the two, which is why we asked artists from the African diaspora to respond. And this facade, which Jorge dos Anjos from Brazil created for the galleries, is in conversation with the Nkisi Nkonde, which is right next to it. It is in conversation with the Benin sculptures, which are behind it. It is in conversation with the Egyptian sculpture, which is right behind it, right? And this kind of conversation between contemporary art and these classical African pieces from the 19th and the 17th century is a way to unfetishize them. We need to eliminate this word fetish because it is a European word that throws doubt on the cultural integrity of the objects which are fetishized by this process. And so in undoing that, you have to remove the mentality that saw the fetish in the first place. You have to remove the mentality that separated these objects in the African diaspora from the people in the African diaspora. So who does this treasure belong to? It belongs to Africa. And who do these people belong to? They belong to Africa. And so when we say the global Africa, this is what we are talking about. It's not that we're saying that restitution should not happen, that stolen objects should not be given back to those from whom they were stolen. We're just saying that if you want to have this conversation, do not forget those in the African diaspora who should be a part of this conversation. Anyway, how do you get to the point of talking about African material culture in the diaspora without talking about the African diaspora? It's a kind of sleight of hand. But once we from the African diaspora engage in this conversation, these museums come alive. Because we're alive. We survived it all. And so did these objects. So these objects are a reflection of the material culture which is embedded in the people that created the objects, in the people that carry the culture of the objects. And were there, if we talk about the Benin statues, were there individuals from the Edo who were enslaved and shipped off to the Americas? Yes. Did the Edo people engage in enslaving and shipping people off? Yes. That's the complexity of our history. That's the complexity of the process. But one of the things we need to bring closer together are these objects and the history of the people that they are connected to. And that's what we try to do in these galleries. On one of the walls, we do a history of exchange on the African continent. And unlike other timelines, you will find in our timeline an obsession with ensslavement's impact on the African continent. Because look, gold was used for exchange in Africa. Salt was used for exchange in Africa. Ivory was used for exchange in Africa. Cloth was used for exchange in Africa. But there is nothing more important than the Africans who were exchanged for material objects on the African continent. There is nothing more important than the human beings who were exchanged for material goods both in Africa and with people outside of Africa. That's how you got the transatlantic slave trade. That's how you got the trans-Indian Ocean slave trade. It wasn't just one slave trade, but that's the devastation the continent felt. Tens of millions of people shipped to Asia. Tens of millions of people shipped to the Americas. Many a million of people found their way to the bottom of the ocean, either in their fight against being enslaved or because of the brutality of the processes themselves. So we want to reconnect that. There has to be this reconnection in order for the African people on the globe to have a sense of wholeness of themselves. The African needs to recognize in the African diaspora themselves. The Africans in the diaspora need to recognize the African in themselves. And maybe this material culture provides a vehicle for that, for reconnecting that rupture caused by the transatlantic slave trade, for repairing that rupture caused by the European classical forms of colonialism on the African continent. Maybe that rupture that exists between Africans and the African diaspora is a way for the European psychic to be repaired in its total disassociation with the humanity of Africans. Maybe this is the way for the Western mentality to find a kind of comfort in its own self and a lack of obsession with its whiteness, a lack of obsession with its Westernness, by being able to breach that divide, being able to empathize with the need to breach, to connect, to undo this rupture.